distinguished lecture series, Dr. Rudy Mate. We're very pleased to be doing this series thanks to the sponsorship and generosity of the Farhan Foundation. We have a couple of their representatives here with us again today, so welcome again back to USC. Let me just say a little bit about Dr. Mate for those of you who weren't here yesterday. His CV and his many accomplishments are too long to go through one by one, but just a few of the highlights. He studied both Persian and Arabic as an undergraduate, and then continued his studies of languages into his graduate work, ultimately taking a PhD in history from the University of California at Los Angeles. He is a former president of the Association for the Study of Persian Societies. Actually, he did that twice. He's been the editor or co-editor of a number of journals, as well as other important scholarly publications in the same field, Persian studies and Iranian studies. He has some 50 articles on Safavid and Qajar, Iran, as well as on Egypt, as well as numerous books, two of which are over here, beautiful covers. I'm very envious. And a number of his books have won prizes from a variety of institutions. Scholarly institutions in the United States, in Britain, as well as from the Iranian government, most recently, I believe. So we're very pleased again to have Dr. Mate with us for the second day and for a second lecture. It's been my great pleasure, our great pleasure, previously to host them, and also to launch this initiative with our friends at the Farhan Foundation. So without any further ado, turn the floor over to Dr. Mate, who's going to be talking to us today about neither east nor west, talking about the concept of self-reliance, self-sufficiency in Iranian thought.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Before I start talking, I would like to tell you how honored and pleased I am to be here for the second time, because I spoke yesterday as well, and how happy I am to have been invited by the University of Southern California. I'd like to thank the Farhan Foundation in particular for their generosity in making this possible, and of course for my gracious hosts, Laurie Brandt and Hani Khafipour. Today I'm going to talk about the idea of self-sufficiency, the quest of self-sufficiency, the historical roots of that in Iran. I think it's a very important and a very interesting topic. And I begin my talk in August 1681. In that year, we have the encounter between a representative of the Dutch East India Company, VOC in Dutch, the acronym, a fellow by the name of Reinier Kazenbrood, with the current Safavid Grand Vizier, Sheikh Ali Khan. The Safavids were the dynasty in power at the time. And the meetings because there was not one, there was a succession of meetings over time, over a couple of weeks, between these two magistrates, had their origins in a controversy over the terms of the silk contract that the Dutch had concluded with the Iranians under Shah Abbas, predecessor of the Shah who reigned at the time, in 1623. Kazenbrood, the Dutch representative, refused to abide by the obligations stipulated in the contract signed by the Dutch, having to purchase a fixed amount of silk from the Shah each year, citing conditions that had changed and that were contrary to the terms of the original contract. Sheikh Ali Khan demurred, stating that the Dutch should simply abide by the clauses of the original contract. At one point during the discussions, Kazenbrood, the Dutch fellow, pointed out that the VOC, the Dutch company, was important for Iran's economic well-being. He reminded the Grand Vizier that the Dutch trade in spices in particular had enriched his country, and that the activities of the Dutch company had helped Bandar Abbas, turned Bandar Abbas from a sleepy fishing village into a thriving commercial port. It's a port in the Persian Gulf through which all the silk and most Iranian export products flowed. Sheikh Ali Khan, highly irritated at what he considered insolent Dutch behavior, dismissively told his interlocutor that all the VOC brought to Iran was worthless bark and leaves, referring to the costly spices such as cinnamon, cardamom, and nutmeg that formed the bulk of Dutch imports into Iran. The Iranians, he insisted, did not need any of this stuff. Kazenbrood was mistaken in thinking that the Shah was an ordinary merchant, and if the Dutch did not like the contract they had signed with Shah Abbas, they should pack up and leave. Okay. It's a very interesting vignette And it goes to the heart of the story that I'm about to tell you, because it is totally relevant, I think, to its topic, the historical roots of the Iranian quest for self-sufficiency, autarky, which is of course the Greek term for that, the idea of being able to produce everything you need within your own realm, within your own country. It's of course an objective, it's been a policy objective of many lands, many countries over time. It's not exclusive to Iran. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the famous French 17th century minister of state, sought to attain self-sufficiency by way of restricting the importation of foreign goods. Both Germany under Hitler and Russia, the Soviet Union under Stalin, sought economic self-sufficiency based on a balance between industry and agriculture. And many modern countries, from Bangladesh to Indonesia to India, have expressed a desire to become self-sufficient, usually in the production of food. So Iran is not a unique country in that sense. But modern Iran, although it's no different, is demonstrably, I argue here, more insistent in proclaiming the theme and more defiant in its articulation of this quest as part of an insistence on cultural greatness and uniqueness. In other words, it goes far beyond economics, which is part of the argument I'm making here. Encapsulated in the neither east nor west theme, literally neither eastern nor western theme of the Islamic Revolution of 1978-79 and its outcome, the Islamic Republic, self-sufficiency has been stridently articulated from Khomeini, the founder of the revolution, to Ahmadinejad, the previous president of Iran, who during his 8-year tenure as Iran's president stated repeatedly that the West needs Iran more than Iran needs the West, and who certainly behaved accordingly, casually and cavalierly dismissing the threat of international sanctions against his country. The Islamic Republic, from its inception, evinced a strong impulse towards self-reliance and self-sufficiency. The leaders of the Islamic Revolution have long publicly believed in autarky, or the idea of producing everything the country needs inside the country. In the case of Khomeini, this was part of an attitude of utter disdain for economic issues, famously, as exemplified in some of his most famous quotes to the effect that economics is for donkeys, is one of his famous statements. And that the revolution was not fought for the price of melons, another very famous one. And to the extent that economic thinking played a role in his thinking, it did not go much beyond the theme of austerity as a virtue. Exemplified in his incantation that the Prophet himself only ate 1 date per day. Now, in the last decade or so, the need and the capacity for self-reliance have taken on the form of a mantra and pronouncements by Iranian officials, and I won't exhaust your patience by listing the instances of utterances, communiques, statements to that effect, namely the idea pronounced with great pride and presumptuousness that Iran was about to become self-sufficient in a whole host of areas and arenas, ranging all the way from steel to submarines to petrochemicals, nanotechnology, veterinary drugs, and even the breeding of laboratory mice. And I'm just selecting a number of statements that I sort of selected from the web, from various Iranian websites and newspapers. And one could argue, and I do argue in some way, and I will ultimately, certainly in the written form of this talk, that even the nuclear issue is very much suffused with this idea of self-sufficiency and the pride and the presumptuousness with which this is articulated. It bespeaks similar claims and aspirations, as does the economy of resistance that was proclaimed by Khomeini, the current supreme leader, in the face of the sanctions instituted against Iran. Now, what makes the theme of self-sufficiency particularly interesting is that it's certainly not limited to the Islamic Republic as a theme, the leadership of the Islamic Republic. The idea that Iran is a proud and self-confident nation, able to take care of itself and its needs, has a very long pedigree. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran's last monarch, too strove for maximum, and I quote here, maximum political and economic independence. It's a phrase from his first biography, Mission for My Country. And he too boasted that before long his country would be self-sufficient in all manner of life's necessities. And I can attest to this. I lived in Iran in 76, 77, and the papers were just bulging with these pronouncements on a daily basis. The same kind of mantra, the same kind of boasting about steel, the 5-year plan had already been fulfilled, and we don't need the outside world for any of the stuff that we consume. What makes this theme particularly interesting as well, I think, and a very complex one, is that it is not it's a tendency that is not limited to Iran's rulers. Shades of it permeate, or at least suffuse, the self-perception of Iranians of all walks in life and educational levels. Since a rediscovery of ancient Iran and the inculcation of its legacy as inherently part of Iran's patrimony from the Reza Shah period onward, from the 1920s onward, Iranians have perceived their nation as being heir to a long, unbroken, unique civilization, running all the way from the reign of Cyrus the Great until today. And the notion that their country is amply endowed with natural resources, even before oil was discovered, and without necessarily taking this asset into account, that it could take care of itself without outside assistance if only foreign powers would allow it, has even older roots. And it is not just those who supported Ahmadinejad, or the regime for that matter, who articulate these notions. Many of those who despise Ahmadinejad and his policies subscribe to the notion that the world needs Iran more than Iran needs the world. Now, when it's the antecedents to these notions that I'd like to explore in the remainder of my talk today, because I also argue that these did not start even with the Shah, but have very ancient roots, and that's precisely the core of the argument. Now, of course, there's a cultural component to this, which also preceded the Islamic Republic, as articulated in philosophical and sort of political science types of works, going all the way back to the famous and at the same time not so well-known Ahmad Farid. He was a philosopher, a rather unremarkable professor at the University of Tehran, who borrowing a great deal from the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, ended up with the notion that Iran and its culture stand for sort of primordial spiritual values, whereas the West, as opposed to the East, Iran, represents cold, soulless, technocratic thinking, crass materialism, and the domination of man over nature. And that whole philosophy, that notion of the sort of the dichotomy between the East, having maintained its spiritual core, its spiritual values, as opposed to the West, it sold its soul in a Faustian bargain for technology and materialism, was further developed and popularized in a way by people like, Al Ahmad, for example, in his Rabzadegi, his West Toxification, and Zarin Kub, Na Shaqi Na Gharbi Irani, meaning neither Western nor Eastern Iranian. So this idea that this is limited to economics is certainly not the case. This was further developed and turned into a cultural argument. And I follow that because I do think that economics is not limited to economics. In any situation, in any condition, it's always very much bound up with cultural values. So that's exactly what I'd like to do in this talk, sort of open up the debate in two ways. I'd like to go beyond politics, to incorporate culture and cultural patterns and its assumptions and presuppositions, and I'd like to go back to actually ancient times, certainly far before the 20th century. And they're linked as far as I argue here. They even go back before the intrusion of colonialism and imperialism, which is very much bound up with this idea, reinforced it, exacerbated it, gave it a new lease on life, if you will, this notion that Iran is threatened and should only take care of itself and has ample means to do so. And for Iranians, colonialism is sort of the core of that notion. We are a vulnerable nation, we are threatened, we have been always at the receiving end of the schemes of people coming from the West, beginning with the Portuguese in the early 16th century, and then followed by the English and the Dutch. who have suffocated us, have robbed us of our riches. And my argument is that, well, that is part of a valid argument, or that argument is in part valid, but it doesn't go to the core of the issue. There are antecedents to the idea of the greatness of Iran and its sense of, uniqueness, and we don't need anyone else, we can take care of ourselves, that far precede 1500. Even though the manifestations of that, as in the way of written documents, become more clear and manifest precisely after 1500s, and it is precisely because it's the foreigners who end up writing about these things more than Iranians, whose writings are more implicit than explicit about this whole issue. So the idea that all this stuff is limited to the 20th century, even the 19th century, I think is a misperception, a false impression. When you read the literature sort of in a superficial way, scholars go back to, say, the Mossadegh period as the start of this obsession with, Iranian suspicion vis-a-vis foreign powers, or they go back to the Constitutional Revolution and the Tobacco Revolt, famous Tobacco Revolt of 1890, which certainly manifests many of these notions, and I will come back to that. But I would like to go much farther back than that. Indeed, I want to go back initially to the core, the root of this issue, by going back to the Greeks, meaning the antiquity. Because I do locate the antecedents to the desire for autarky and as a cultural construct, if you will, all the way to Greek philosophers, and most particularly to Aristotle, and his idea of the household as the embodiment of the economy. The economy, as conceived by Aristotle, was precisely located in the city-state, the polis, and within that, in the household. It's a moral issue as much as an economic issue. In Aristotle's ontology, each thing has a nature as well as a teleology, a final cause towards which it moves inexorably. This is sort of the law of nature, if you will. And it pertains to his thinking about economics as much as to any other human relationship. Aristotle conceived of the economy as a household economy, the objective of which, according to him, is the good life by way of independent maintenance and reproduction, under the administrative of the master of the house. It's a closed system built on the idea of that balance, harmony, and equilibrium are signs of a well-ordered commonweal, and that change is to be feared and averted rather than welcomed and embraced. And in this thinking, resources are available and provided for, and wealth and making money are themselves the end. And the need for exchange starts with relative shortages and surpluses in different areas, but the ultimate goal is the reestablishment, the restoration of the natural equilibrium. So exchange may be necessary, but it's not necessarily desirable, and it's always a means to an end. You exchange in order to bring the system back into balance, equilibrium. And the prudent go home to the restricted economy of autarky, pursuing domestic production for domestic consumption. That's the sort of, summing up Aristotle's idea about the economy. And this conception of the economy is essentially a closed system focused on the household. The in-group is important, I think, because these ideas reverberate through time, in East and West. This is not just a matter of Iran versus the West. These ideas were at the heart of Western economic thinking, really until the Enlightenment, with some exceptions. Of course, there are people who break out of this earlier, but it's a general idea. These things persist in the West as well until the Enlightenment. And continue to sort of creep in and pop up in debates pitting free trade against protectionism, and this sort of instinctive notion that we should sort of close the gates and live on our own and be free from all these horrible foreigners. So in that sense, it reverberates even longer and beyond the Enlightenment. It's very much embedded in, quote-unquote, Islamic economic thinking through time, and really until the 19th, and in some ways into the 20th century. This idea, Islamic theory starts on the assumption of the economy as a physiocratic idea. That is, it's heavily focused on agriculture as the ultimate source of wealth and prosperity. And it talks about fiscal interests mitigated by welfare interests. Those are the two sort of poles in that whole conception. The idea is, of course, a cycle of justice, creating prosperity by bringing land under cultivation, under good management, creating products and produce in order to keep the system going, to perpetuate the system. But ultimately, it's still the idea of the closed economy. You know, as much comes in as goes out. And it's about the manageability of consumption, which is very important. And again, self-sufficiency is the ultimate goal. And you might say that in the Iranian case, this was particularly relevant and certainly not artificially constructed in the sense that if you look at Iran as a geographical entity, the plateau surrounding by, you know, high mountains and fierce deserts, which makes communications very difficult, you have a series of sort of self-enclosed systems, all these oasis cities, Esfahan and Kerman and Yaza and so forth, are organic systems unto themselves, traditionally speaking, before the coming of railways and metal roads and so forth. So they did take care of themselves. And yes, there was a trickle of trade between them, but they were really islands, rather self-sufficient islands. So this system was not simply, an academic discourse and wholly artificial and idealist, if you will. But this really pertained to the situation on the ground as well. People did take care of themselves in a local fashion, as opposed to people living around the Mediterranean, for example, who had these outlets, these natural and inevitable outlets that naturally brought trade and its influence. Iran was a rather self-contained and effectively a landlocked country until modern times, because the Persian Gulf didn't barely function as a natural outlet. We see the manifestations of all this in the writings, sparse though they may be, because there isn't a whole lot about Islamic economics, and it's in part because it's not a separate area, it's not a separate science, if you will. It's embedded in moral writings, in particular in the so-called Mirror for Princes literature. And you see it reverberate and in a rather unchanging mode in various authors, from Ibn Sina to Nasruddin Tusi and Ibn Khaldun to Nizam al-Mulk. And it's always the same thing in the sense that it's focused on the needs of the household, either a private house or a metaphorical one. The state is conceived as a larger household, as a sort of umbrella household, if you will. And it's always, the key is always the idea of balance between fiscal revenue, the need to maintain the ability of the taxpayer to deliver the revenue, balance between consumption, production and consumption, the need to set maximum prices, to control all that, and to inspect the market. The muhtasib, the market inspector is very important there. And of course, the pragmatic aim is to avoid urban unrest and bread riots, if you will. That is really the ultimate goal. So again, there's a practical element involved. And provisionism is at the heart of it. This idea that it's important to import, should stimulate imports, and you should prevent exports as much as possible, which of course goes exactly against our modern idea of the economy. We want to maximize our exports and control our imports as much as possible, because that sort of increases our wealth. But the traditional Islamic notion is the exact opposite. You want to increase your imports, especially foodstuffs, because you want to provision your capital, especially. You want to prevent famine, which is always around the corner. And you want to keep your money inside. So again, that's where the closed system comes in, and the lack of a notion of the economy as an expanding proposition. We can all boats can be lifted if we work on it properly. So that runs through history in a very interesting and visible way. So it comes out of the Greeks. And there is an Islamic addition to this, and that is the idea that economic activity is a means for human salvation and the preservation of Islam. And then there's an Iranian addition to it, which has to do with this idea that at the core of all of this, there's justice. Justice is the pivotal concept in statecraft in Iranian, political thinking going well way back before Islamic times. And again, you know, there's a lot of that in Western thinking as well. I'd like to reiterate that there's no dichotomy really until relatively modern times, certainly early modern times between Iran, Ottoman Empire, the Mughal states, Islamic states on the one hand, and the West on the other hand. In the West, we have the same kind of impulses. We have sumptuary laws, which have to do again with sort of frugality as a moral imperative, quite similar to what happens in much of the Islamic world in this period. And so provisionism, again, is very important here. And attached to it is fear of exports as a drain on the national wealth. Then we get into the role of the state. And here we find a difference already much earlier than the Enlightenment, 18th, 19th century. And that is that provisionism actually gives ample room for foreign participation, because there are economic realities, which means that most Islamic states, Muslim states, Iran, certainly were not well equipped to sail the seas, for example. You know, they depended on the foreigners to build ships and to provide shipping facilities. And there was also a different attitude in general about the participation of foreigners. You know, in Europe in the 17th century, you already see the boundaries of who's in and who's out go up, which later leads to national, you know, exclusionary policies. In Iran, Ottoman Empire, same thing, Mughal India. It's like, you know, everyone can sort of come in and partake of the commercial activity, the series of commercial activities. There's not this exclusionary attitude. In other words, Iranians and Turks, you know, Ottomans allow foreigners to set up shop in the form of these Western companies, you know, to establish factories, to participate in trade, clearly supervised and at the behest, or at the sufferance of the Shah. So there was no hegemony and certainly no colonialism. You know, they knew their place and they could be thrown out of the country at a moment's notice, but they were allowed in, whereas France, for example, in the 17th century already does not allow Armenians to have representation in places like Toulon and Marseille, for example, because they were not French. Unthinkable in Iran and the Ottoman Empire. So in that sense, this role of the state is very different, and I have no time to go further into this, but this participation of foreigners is very interesting, because we end up having this interesting dynamic, mostly described by foreigners, which suggests already in the 16th and the 17th century that Iranians, even though they let foreigners in, have a very sort of, you know, self-evident cultural superiority which they are ready to display, as was seen in the vignette with which I started. That, you know, we don't need these foreigners. Yeah, we'll let you in, but, you know, it's on our terms, and we can throw you out. If you don't like it here, you just go. And we don't need your stuff anyway, really. Okay? That is the message. And it's a message that gets reiterated over time. This is not one little incident. This is not one sort of example that I'm blowing up and for which I can be accused of you know, generalizing, extrapolating from a minor incident. This gets reiterated over time. We have the same kind of example with the Dutch a few decades later. It's almost the same kind of discussion, it's the same tenor. If you don't like it, please leave. You know, we don't need you, really, because we're far beyond this. And trade is, yeah, it's important, but, you know, the Shah is not a merchant. Come on, you know, don't get us wrong. You guys are all about that. The Dutch, you are a merchant republic. We don't understand what's going on. You know, merchants on top of things, merchants who rule a republic. What is that? You know, it's part of a whole host of conceptions, preconceptions, and notions that get played out here in these conversations. We have the same thing in 1733 when Nader Shah, you know, the fellow I talked about yesterday, is in power. Exactly the same disputes about the rights and privileges and concessions made to the Dutch in Iran. And again, they're told that all they imported was rags and tree bark that Iran could do without and save money to boot. You know, it doesn't get any clearer. And it's interesting because the tree bark and the rags get repeated over time. It's almost like someone wrote them down. You know, when you get into discussion with the Dutch, bring this up as a sort of stock and trade series of notions. Because we get the same thing in the Zand period. You know, the second half of the 18th century, we have a famous and interesting discussion between Karim Khan Zand, the ruler himself, and the English representative by the name of Skips, where Karim Khan dismissively tells the EIC, East India Company, representative that Iran didn't need all the stuff offered by the English. And Rustam al-Hukama, who's the source of this, he's a literateur from late 18th, early 19th century, very interesting work, sort of a facts and fiction mixed together. He's the source, and he bets this dialogue, this discussion, into an argument for the ideal of self-sufficiency. So he sort of theorizes this. It's not just an anecdote, but it's part of a larger discussion. It's not that long, but it's enough to give you a sense that it's part of a worldview and a set of sensibilities. Now, of course, there's no question to my mind that much of this concern about autarky was pragmatic. The people in the West, the English and the Dutch, were also concerned about the outflow of bullion. Don't get me wrong, They also wrote tracts and treatises, trying to prevent this from happening, trying to devise a system to maximize export without the export of bullion. They had to send a lot of bullion to Asia because Asia was not really waiting for a lot of Western products. It's actually the other way around. And the Europeans tended to have to send gold and silver to India and through the Middle East in order to satisfy their craving for textiles and, precious textiles and spices and so forth. The most conspicuous form of this quest for self-sufficiency throughout time, and there are many manifestations of this, is the notion of import substitution. This idea that rather than import stuff, certainly non-food products, we should manufacture them ourselves. It reinforces the idea of self-sufficiency, as a process. And we see examples of that in policies of Shah Abbas, the famous ruler, the most important king of the Safavid period, early 17th century. He tries to import cotton, or the technology rather, from India, so he can grow it himself. He does the same with dye stuffs, which also mostly have to come from India. Rice, among other things. And it's all centered on this notion that Iran should manufacture its own products. So this is an impulse that runs through time, and I'll give you a few examples, but I could multiply them beyond Shah Abbas. We have Nader Shah, the same Nader Shah from the 18th century, who orders the use of domestic cloth for his soldiers' uniforms. It's repeated by Abbas Mirza. I think I mentioned him as well yesterday, the oldest son and the heir-to-be of Fath Ali Shah, early 19th century, the new regime, the Qajars, who orders the same thing, tries to have uniforms produced for his soldiers in Iran rather than importing cloth from outside. And Reza Shah in the 20th century does the same thing. He has several ordinances along the same lines. Then we get into a slightly same theme, import substitution, but with nationalist overtones, because I don't think you can speak of nationalism per se, perhaps proto-nationalism, but certainly not full-fledged nationalism, until the 19th century. And perhaps the first one with whom this becomes manifest is Amir Kabir, the famous prime minister of Nasruddin Shah. Around 1850, he is murdered at the behest of Nasruddin Shah in 1852. And in his letters, you find this. There are many references to the fact that Iran's products, such as Kerman shawls, precious silk shawls, and sugar from Mazandaran, are not on par with foreign products. And he's particularly known for his preference for Iranian products and his initiatives towards local production, from samovars to sugar. Okay? And he's famous for that. It's part of a sort of setting up of a national industry. And there are other examples as well, and I'll skip those. Now, samovars and samovars and sugar are related to tea, which is another excellent example of this quest for self-sufficiency. There's a fellow by the name of Kashif al-Saltaneh, the official who is traditionally and erroneously credited with the importation of tea, the first one to introduce tea in Iran. He wasn't the first one, even though he was instrumental because he went to India to sort of explore and learn about the production techniques and so forth. And he has this treatise in which he talks about the same thing. We buy all this tea from India and our treasure gets wasted. It's a drain on our resources. We should bring tea to Iran, cultivate it in Iran, and end all this waste. And he gives facts and figures. You know, millions of Ottomans are thrown out by importing tea from India. And it's a simple solution to end that problem. And we have the same impulse in the sparse literature on economic issues in the 19th century. It's not a well-developed field, in part, again, because it builds mostly on these sort of ideas, medieval ideas, Islamic ideas about the economy embedded in a moral universe and so forth. And it's simply not an independent arena of investigation. I think it's actually, when you start thinking about it, it's one of the weaknesses of the Middle East, in retrospect, that they probably paid so little attention to economics as a system and as a set of propositions of how to go about organizing your wealth. Not just husbanding it, but making it productive, if you will. You see this in the relative lack of theoretical writings about this. So there isn't much, but there is quite just enough to sort of reinforce, strengthen my argument. There's, for example, an anonymous tract called Siyasat al-Mudun, the author of which remains obscure. We know that he studied in Germany in 1870s, and he may have picked up some of his ideas there in the Bismarckian period. And he talks about, again, he laments the decline of Iran as a result, in part, of its total dependence on foreign powers and on foreign productivity. And he argues that under Fath Ali Shah, the first king of the Qajars, Iran was able to produce its own silk, and that we again need to encourage domestic productivity, domestic trade, and the manufacturing of domestic commodities in order to fulfill the needs of our own people. And he talks about, the imperative, as far as he sees it, for even the Shah to wear Iranian cloth, silk and cotton and so forth. And, he says that the material coming from Kerman and Khorasan and the felts from Kerman, the velvets from Kashan are just as good, better than the ones coming from Europe. So why go abroad for all this stuff? And then we get to the Constitutional Revolution, tobacco movement and the Constitutional Revolution, 1890s into the early 20th century. And you find the same impulses whenever you look at economic issues, whenever you look at the actual movements, because say the Constitutional Revolution is typically constructed as a search for freedom and representation, and that was part of it, but underlying there were lots of anxieties about economic issues and dependence on foreign powers. Certainly articulated by the clerics, by the ulama, but also by merchants, of course, in part for pragmatic reasons. They were losing markets to foreign, British and Russian merchants and companies and so forth. But there was also this moral argument underneath this idea we are just as good. We can produce all this stuff ourselves. Why should we buy all this stuff? Why did we give these preferential treatments to British merchants and Russian agents and so forth? There's no need for that. We have to restructure this. And when you look at the outcome of the Constitutional Revolution, the first written constitution Iran receives in 1907, and you begin to scrutinize it, it is really designed in part as a millstone around the neck of the Shah to prevent him from giving out concessions to foreign powers and thereby becoming dependent on foreign powers. Because the Shah, of course, has reneged on his primary obligation to be the protector of the Iranian nation as an Islamic state, to protect the Bayzah Islam, which is the term used, the fortress of Islam, and that's why people argue against it, not because he's a despot. They may use the term, but they don't really mean it in our sense of the word. It's a guy who has sold out the country to foreign interests. So there is that same element. And you look at articles in Habl al-Matin, for example, an important exile publication produced in India, and there are several articles harping on that same theme. Why do we buy all this stuff from foreign countries? Why do we weaken ourselves willfully by becoming so dependent economically on foreign powers? There's no need for that. We're a great nation. We're wonderful. Yes, we've declined, but we can claw back to greatness if we put our minds to it. And the other impulse, or the other manifestation, I should say, was a boycott of foreign goods, which is already precisely the heart, you might say, of the tobacco revolt, of course. In the resistance against the giving out of the concession by the Shah, But you find it in many other instances. You find it most particularly in a great deal of a number of instances of boycotts, calls for boycotts, boycotts against Russian goods in the north. The Russians were, of course, intruding commercially. The British were intruding in the south. Women played a very important role in that, calling for the use of domestic goods and materials and cloth and so forth. Merchants got into the game, and so there are many examples of these outbursts of sort of proto-nationalist pride in the form of boycotting foreign goods. And of course, you see this in the last instance of that is the Islamic Revolution of 1978-79, the attempt, or at least call, to boycott foreign cigarettes, Marlboro and so forth, and Winston. And as always, these things never work. They never work anyway, because we all like to go to Walmart in the end, right? Iranians or Americans, doesn't matter. So Iranians never really followed suit, certainly not the common man, because the foreign product ends up being cheaper, so you buy it anyway. But the impulse is there, the calls, the orchestration is there in various instances. Another manifestation is the establishment of a number of local companies, Shirkat Islamiyeh, for example, in part propagated by the clerics. So okay, let's start our own clothing manufacturing, as a monopoly. Islamically produced clothing, for example. And they don't really get off the ground. There are several initiatives. Some work for a while, even different branches in various cities, but they never really get going, and they never reach a takeoff point, if you will. But again, the impulse is there. And then, of course, we have, all this gets exacerbated in 1907. If you want to pick one year in which Iranians become nationalistic in the modern sense of the word, beyond, as opposed to simply proud of their culture, but sort of a politically underpinned argument that one can call nationalism, it's 1907. It's the year in which the British and the Russians make this agreement whereby they partition the countries into spheres of influence. It's really a wake-up call for especially the intellectuals, and it is from that moment on that you see arguments about the dependence on Iran really articulated as nationalist arguments, not simply as sort of instinctive rejecting foreigners along the Islamic principles or Shi'i principles, but really a set of political notions that go far beyond that. And so we have many more examples of that, and I won't tire you with that. Other than that, to finish by talking a little bit about the Pahlavi dynasty, the one that came to power in 1925 and that lasted until 1979. It has the same impulses. Reza Shah, the first one, is of course quintessentially focused on this idea of making Iran strong and independent from foreign powers. He has a clear aversion to foreigners, which is found its most strident expression in the prohibition for Iranians to visit foreign embassies and legations, whereby he practically terminates social contact with foreign residents. He already in 21, the year of the coup that brought him up to power, he promulgates a law, or he forces the promulgation of the law because he's not formally in charge yet, that says that government employees and army personnel can only wear cloth made in Iran, all of his policy measures are really geared towards this idea of strong Iran, producing what we can inside, and not being dependent on foreign countries. And of course, when you look at the intellectuals operating in this ambiance during the reign of Reza Shah, they follow suit. You have the famous De Khuda, who advocated self-sufficiency in an article he published in a journal, Furush, which was edited in Istanbul. Most importantly, and most interestingly, you have Ahmad Kasravi, famous secular, stridently anti-Shi'i intellectual, a rationalist, and a devoted secularist, who borrowed from a number of European thinkers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, got his economic ideas from Jean-Charles Léonard de Sismondi. He talks about the free market as the ideal, and it's essential for the welfare of the country. He considered trade to be natural and necessary. Yet he subscribed to the idea of self-sufficiency for Iran, arguing for a closed system along thoroughly traditional lines, based on the old notion of provisionism, according to which the export of especially foodstuffs would come at the expense of the Iranian people. For him, foreign trade was a simple issue. You know, what we have and what we do not need we will export, and what we need and do not have we will import. So he totally believes in author. One could even argue that, and I do argue in a way, that even the Mossadegh interludes, you know, the famous story of the prime minister who comes to power and begins to challenge the Shah and the British, was hardly an interruption in this regard. The prime minister's oil nationalization, the famous oil nationalization, 1951-53, was suffused with the notion of autarky, of not needing the outside world, and one might add in a rather unrealistic stance of defiant nationalism that arguably counted more on providential redemption than on results based on a realistic assessment of relative strength and weaknesses. But still, Mossadegh and his advisors clearly were convinced that the world was dependent on Iranian oil, and that the world, in the end, needed Iran more than Iran needed the world. And then we come to the Islamic Republic, where we have a continuation of these same impulses, and at the same time, I think, a reversal or a reintroduction or a revival of the very old notions, the sort of basic Aristotelian notions, certainly as articulated by Khomeini in a very simplistic way. Khomeini got, I think, a lot of his economic ideas, and as far as he thought economically, from someone like Nawab Safavi, the founder of the Fedayeen Islam, arguably the first fundamentalist movement, certainly in Iran, whose ideas very much have influenced the Islamic Republic in many ways. You know, and for Nawab Safavi, you know, the attar, the druggist, and the baqal, meaning the greengrocer, possessed of moral qualities, is far better equipped to deal with the economy than all these sophisticated, fake, cheating and swindling economic specialists. Leave it up to them and everything will be all right. That is basically his notion. And ultimately, it all boils down to actually the original meaning of the term economy, namely saving frugality. Okay? That's the core of the issue. And if you look at Khomeini's book, Hukumat Islami, Islamic Government, which he wrote in the 1970s, it is all, well, there's very little about the economy in it, but and as far as you find traces of it, it's all about a return, again, to the household economy, and that is really his idea of running the economy of a modern country. He talks about waste and the plundering of Iran's wealth and resources, and the country being turned into a market for expensive, unnecessary goods by the representatives of foreign capitalists hungry to plunder the wealth of Iran. He hails the notion of a market-oriented Islamic economy pursuing self-sufficiently. He talked about that, sufficiency, based on small-scale agricultural and artisanal commodity production, with little contact with the outside world, certainly nothing beyond absolute necessity. And the goal seems to be generalized austerity amounting to shared poverty. That is really what Khomeini advocates in so many ways. And the tenor is, again, the moral economy based on the idea of a return to the idyllic ascetic times of the Prophet. You know, eating one day to day. And the underlying fear, and I think this is very important because this still is visible in the basic anxieties of those who control the Islamic Republic today. The underlying fear is deregulation, unleashing desire, and releasing a lust from consumerism, from social restraint. So again, the equilibrium gets completely out of whack. So in the end, an economic theory in the eyes of Khomeini amounts to little more than a denunciation of comprador capitalism under the Shah and pious incantations against exploitation, inequality, and injustice. And I've reached the end of my talk. Let me sum it up by making two observations. And the first one is that, you know, this is a kind of talk that comes at the risk of presentism, sort of projecting current ideas and current notions backward all the way to 2,000 years ago. And I'm fully aware of that. I'm still wrestling with that part of it in terms of writing up the paper for ultimate publication. The second one is that, you know, I do think, and I hope to have brought this out in a somewhat persuasive way, that economic thinking is never divorced, can never be divorced from cultural notions. It's always bound up. In every which system, look at America, you know, the way we think about economics is all about culture in a way at the same time. And so it's no different in Iran. And finally, I think we have to realize that the issue of self-reliance is a complex one. Because as I started out by saying, it's visible as an impulse among many countries throughout history, and it's sort of a natural impulse. Who doesn't want to be self-sufficient in a way? No one wants to be dependent on, you know, all kinds of forces that one cannot control. So to that extent, it's a natural instinct. Of course, you know, the Iranian economy as it plays out in the Islamic Republic is by no means tantamount to simply following the precepts of self-sufficiency. It's a modern economy. It has many flaws and problems and defects. But the mantra of self-sufficiency is mostly that. It's a mantra. It's a sort of an invocation, constantly reiterated for political purposes. So it bears no real reality to reality. It has no real bearing on reality. And then, of course, it's also a notion, and it's the last I'll say, filled with paradox and even contradictions. After all, Iran is not North Korea. You know, Iranians have always sought self-sufficiently, the argument that I've been making, and have been proud of their country as being unique and abundantly provided with resources, and they've always been wary of foreign intent and design. You know, push the par there, who's acting, who's behind all this stuff. But they have also never failed to enthusiastically embrace the world and to engage with it in many ways, unlike a place like North Korea, for example. So I think I should present that as a caveat as well. I thank you for your attention. Right.
This notion of no West, Middle East, Nasha, anarchy, don't you think it's somehow being exploited by some political leaders and some politicians, and it's even more deeply ingrained in Iranian culture and social psychology? Because then I think about, for example, writing of Jamal and it's very well, it comes up from that. Or even before that, or similar time like that, but the tiny book I remember written by Hossein Qasem-Zadeh Iran Shah called Najafiyat Iranian, which was, I remember, I read it previous century when I was a teenager. And then you see that it's being really exploited in the political arena and in the economic self-sufficiency, and that this notion of, for lack of better exceptionalism, that you see that in Hossein Qasem-Zadeh Iran Shah explanation of that, or Jamal Zadeh later on when Trojan College, Professor Mahmoud Sayyad in his seminal book, Political Culture of Iran, that's called the 5th edition. This is an empirical study of political culture. They are, you see that some sort of a recurring theme of this notion of exceptionalism. That was in the culture, social psychology, but it has been exploited by some political leaders for whatever reason.
Well, absolutely. I totally agree with that. I mean, I think you agree with me, presumably, judging from your words, that it is there and it was articulated by people who were not necessarily in the leadership of Iran in whatever period. And I've traced it back much longer, much farther back than the 19th century in this talk, because I do think there's something there that resonates until today. But the fact that it's being exploited and used for further gain by modern politicians, there's no question about it. That was not the focus of the paper, but I mentioned that immediately. Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Thank you very much. How do you feel that the drive for self-sufficiency has changed over the last 30 years?
Well, if anything, I think it has, I get the impression, even though I don't follow it on a daily basis, I don't read K-On.
Not just in political policies, but
right.
as a notion, as an idea.
Well, first of all, I do think it has intensified as a drumbeat in an increasingly desperate way, almost. The more Iran is falling behind, and the higher inflation is, and greater mismanagement of the economy by Ahmadinejad, the more they have to proclaim the opposite, that we are not just proud and great, but we're reaching all our goals in the 5-year plans, and the production of cement exceeds our expectations, and we're no longer dependent on surrounding countries for that stuff. That's one. And the other one is that sorry, I forgot what was the
Yes,
question.
well, I guess, do you feel like Iranian intellectuals, there has been a shift in their support for self-sufficiency?
Oh, right, yes. Yeah, no, I do think, and then it's anecdotal, it's inherently hard to quantify and to substantiate, of course. But there is, and I think I alluded to that briefly, even among those who hate the regime, inherently, or oftentimes visibly, a pride in the fact that yes, the Islamic Economics, all of its flaws and all of its horrors, is the first time we have become independent, not perhaps in individual arenas, but as a sort of as a political notion. We are no longer dependent on the West, and that is the achievement. That even though we may hate Khomeini, and I've experienced with people telling me that literally, I hate the guy, he destroyed our country, and yet I'm so proud of him because he made us independent. So to that extent, I think this is pride in self-sufficiency, cultural self-sufficiency, perhaps even more than economic self-sufficiency. It's not just the privilege of the rulers and the notion to abuse by them, but it's really part of the sort of the discourse and the thinking of common people. And perhaps even, with the focus on the operative term being the common people, who may not know anything about economics, but still have this sense of, yes, we stand tall against America, against the West, the overbearing imperialist West. So that, I think, is different from the time of the shop.
Professor, thank you for your presentation. I was introduced or told to come out here by my prof, and great topic. Question for you: what, as an undergrad, as a college student, what should we anticipate for the next 20 to 30 years? In terms of Israel, and it's a serious question. It's very.
In terms of Israel?
In terms of Israel, in terms of Iran as a nation state, in terms of its relation with America, in terms of its resources.
But I'm the wrong person to ask. You should ask my colleague Laura Brown. She's a political scientist.
How does culture influence their perceptions?
Well, this notion, all these notions, they won't go away because my argument or I believe that cultures don't change overnight. They're not like underwear, right? They may change gradually. There's always an undercurrent that remains visible through the centuries almost. Okay, and this is not an argument for frozenness in time, but it is it's an argument for the longue durée. The fact that they're
substrata that do not change, and if they do, very gradual, glacial, if you will. So to that extent, I think in 30 years, Iranians will still be convinced that their country is a very important one, and sort of, not a minor power, but a power to be reckoned with. All of which goes into the nuclear issue, by the way. The difficulty of coming to misunderstandings and a different presupposition that go into this business on either side. But when it comes to the fate of the Islamic Republic, I don't know what you want me to tell you. I mean, I do think, I've always thought that the Islamic Republic was here to stay. 5 years after the revolution, when people were somewhat wishful thinkingly way, hoping and thinking they would be wiped out and would crumble into its own contradiction and so forth. I always thought it was not that easily removable because I saw that these people had learned very well from the mistakes the Shah had made, and that they also were from a completely different social class. The people who were surrounding the Shah, they had their sort of assets and their interests, not necessarily in Iran, so they decamped, they left the ship before it sank. These guys have nowhere to go. They come from the Shahistan, from the provinces and so forth. But they have roots in Iran, and where would they go anyway? Of course, they have their assets in Switzerland too, but in terms of belonging identity, they're really Iranian in that sense. And of course, they've been very smart about building institutions in a way that shows, parallel institutions, intelligence next to the army, and then you have the Basijis take care of young people, sort of harnessing the hormones and so forth. So they've been very smart about it. And they have given Iran a sense of pride. And of course, they were helped by the Iranian war in a way, the martyrdom and the sacrifice, and this idea of being beleaguered, rallying the troops, everything fits there. And yet, it won't last, because it can't last. Because if only because there is a whole cohort of young people who are connected to the world, extremely savvy, they're extremely well educated, they're pushing for change, and they're pushing the envelope, and especially women. They are in the forefront of all of it. And the ranks are swelling to the point where at some point the whole thing will just have to collapse. But when and how that will happen, we saw the 2009 Green Movement, and it was crushed. Because the Iranians also don't want blood flow in the streets anymore, so they retreat. But at some point, it will become untenable. But don't ask me when, because that could be tomorrow and it could be 5 years from now. That's my real answer. Sure.
Is it possible that this sense of self-sufficiency comes out of the fear of being dependent and being then put under the pressure of the sanctions that we see today?
Well, yes, it's very instinctive, it's very visceral, but again, that may be the manifestation today, but it doesn't go to the heart of the instinct. It's something that's very deeply rooted.
Is there any evidence in the history, like the satellite, for example, they have, they didn't give equipment, military in the army stuff to shop,
No.
and they wanted to create themselves.
Yeah, maybe a little bit on the surface, but I don't think underneath that was an issue. Yeah, Shah Abbas was disappointed because he asked for armaments from Venice and so forth, and nothing ever came. And he was, very upset at some point with the Europeans, but they kept coming, creating an alliance against the Ottomans, and he was ready, even though I don't think he was ready either. And at some point he got just frustrated and impatient, these guys, and yet another delegation. Don't tell me the same thing because you guys just, a lot of shouting, a lot of words and no action, right? But at the same time, I think he was too much of an accomplished politician to really be naive enough to think that anything would ever come of that. So for him, I think it was also a rhetorical device in order to intimidate and scare the Ottomans. But we have a lot of blustering rather than thinking that anything might come, or actually working himself towards the alliance. So I don't think he was too smart a politician to be fooled by that. I think.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yes.
So you set up the talk as neither east nor west, not east
Right.
nor western.
No.
But I think also implicit in it is us, not other. In other words, so there's a different kind of, or there's another distinction that's part of this emphasis on self-sufficiency.
Right.
So I'm curious about how, I realize you can't give an entire historical sweep for this, but how the notion of foreign to foreigners as we go over time is when the term foreigner is used, is this meant to refer primarily to, say, the British or the Russians who were trying to encroach upon Iranian territory? So is the us largely constituted in territorial terms? Because you also mentioned that given this notion that it was better to have things coming in as opposed to going out, which is also going on in the possession of the economy, that people could come in and they were welcome to do their production there. So it seems to me to kind of problematize this whole notion of who's the foreigner and who isn't. And then sort of related to it, separate from that, is when in Iran's modern history do we actually have the notion of citizenship constituted formally legally?
Yes. Very good question. Well, you know, in the Safavid period, before that, it's all very undifferentiated. You know, you have a vague notion of Farang, you know, going back to medieval time, lumping everyone together, not distinguishing, at least as far as the sources tell us. Safavid period gets more differentiated. Even though the term in Iran, in Persian source, Persian language source, remains Farang, with scarcely any differentiation. In other words, Farang, an embassy from Farang came, it could be Portuguese or Dutch. Occasionally you get a distinction. Foreigners write that the Iranians did, yes, use Farang, but they knew the difference between the Dutch and the English and the Italians, and they had stereotypes attached to them. You know, the Italians were charming, the liars, and the French were very sort of sophisticated, and the British were good merchants, and the Dutch were very good merchants, the better merchants, and you know, the Russians were inebriated, thick-skulled, you know, uncultured, and so forth, right?
What about the Ottomans?
Well, the Ottomans are, you know, in a way the ultimate of it, but at the same time they're Muslim, fellow Muslims, so it's very ambivalent about them. You know, they're of course heretics, but at the same time they're, you know, there's a big Padishah in Istanbul with whom you've waged war, but you're sort of, you know, you're inferior militarily, so there's respect. That holds for vis-a-vis Europe too. They have no respect for the Dutch. They have only respect for the Dutch in as much as the Dutch are very good merchants, and they make money and so forth. And they sail the world, but in terms of their political systems, again, it's Republican. They don't understand it. It's like, Republic? What is that? Why would you lower yourself to that kind of notion? You're a bunch of merchants run your state. You have a king. That type of thing. It's at once a collective notion, Farang, which really continues into the 19th century in some ways. It begins to change, of course, once Iranians begin to travel in numbers to Europe. As of the 18th century, two types of foreigners sort of begin to stand out, and it's precisely the Russians and the English. The Russians have...
European kind of term. Is it foreigner doesn't have like it's not a linguistic designation, it's not really a religious designation.
No, it's a territorial / cultural, so it makes up a Christian, and it's territorial from the northwest. But it gets more distinct in the 18th century because first the Russians, of course, they are impinging on Iran, and they're the big imperialists, and they remain the big imperialists, arguably until today, until quite recently, certainly. And so the Russians sort of emerge as a distinct other, and the other becomes the English, certainly as of the early 19th century. And you might say that towards the late 19th century, there are only two types of foreigners. Again, it's the Russians and the British. With one, they interact mostly, the ones who meddle, the one who sort of buy people from the Shah down, you know, the grandees, the elite from the Shah down gets on the payroll of either or both. So they collaborate with the foreigners. So you get a very ambivalent and ambiguous relationship. There's admiration, there's disdain, there's perhaps even self-hatred involved, you know, or some dependence, whose fault is that? You know, we take their money and so forth. And then, of course, it gets more complicated towards the Germans begin to intrude as the non-British and the non-Russian, and they get welcomed for that reason. They don't have colonial aspirations, quote unquote. And then ultimately the Americans are brought in as foreigners, another sort of salvation, potential salvation. Good foreigners who don't have intentions, evil intentions in that country. And of course, it's always followed by disappointment. very good self-identification in a roundabout way, as is always the case, of course. I think in an even more pronounced way in the case of Iran, is formulated in interaction with and in a reflective manner vis-a-vis foreigners, and especially specific foreigners, such as, again, the Russian.
And when does the notion, is there a legal concept of citizenship?
Well, it really only starts with gradually following the constitutional revolution and really sort of formulated in a more legal and legalistic way under the Shah, in terms of taking on last names and things of that nature, registering birth and days of death and so forth. So it's not that long ago in a way.
Other questions?
We were talking about the declining period in the Middle East, especially when with the onset of 18th century, the empire and Safavid, Iran, and Turkey, and this idea of self-sufficiency really gets intensified. To what extent do you see that play out in this highly problematic notion of decline after this great Muslim empires that they were going through? Marshall Hudson's famous example is that if a Martian had visited Earth around 1600s, he would have speculated that the Muslim world would have ruled the globe in 200 years. And if that Martian would have revisited Earth at this time, we would be shocked to see such a decline as
Well, I don't necessarily follow Marshall there. I find it debatable. Maybe if you go back a little further, you might have more than half a point. But yes, a half a point, I think. And it is precisely, what I talked about yesterday, 18th century is pivotal here. Because in the Safavid period, it's clear to me at least that already in 1500, certainly in 1600, cognitively speaking, in terms of knowledge and having a sense of the globe and its parameters, the Europeans were already far ahead. Not just materially, but in terms of, cognition. All right. So the preconditions were all there, and were gathering steam. But yes, in the 17th century, Westerners went to Isfahan and they stood in awe of the magnificent buildings and the power of the Shah, and the sophistication of the institutions and the caravanserais and so forth, and how the trade system worked, and the safety of the place, which is very important, gets repeated all the time. You get robbed and you get the provincial governors held responsible, so you get your stuff back from the Shah. It's very impressive. So, until 1650, 1675, maybe even 1700, there's that element, even though it's a mixed picture because Westerners, and unfortunately we don't have much on the Iranian side as a counterpart, because very few Iranians go to Europe at that time. And it's very unfortunate because it would be beautiful to compare and contrast these two views, but we can't do it, it's very skewed. But so Europeans also say, well, these things aren't well organized, and the Shah is a real despot, he chops off heads at will. And Isfahan is, beautiful, but it's very dirty. Paris is much better organized in terms of picking up the trash and so forth, let alone other cities. But the pivotal country is really, again, the 18th century, when Iran really falls behind in developmental terms. I'm not even talking about culture. Even that, because in order to produce a certain level of culture, you need a certain level of political cohesion. It cannot just be murder and mayhem. Okay? Maybe, some of the best poetry is written under the Mongols, as we know. So maybe that's not totally true, but still even helps to have some safety and some, provisions, some facilities in life before you can start writing your poetry. But the 18th century, in developmental terms, is, I think, crucial because Iran does fall behind. And Europe does forge ahead in every which way, in innovation and inventions and technology and further reconnoitering and learning and becoming familiar with the globe and other peoples and so forth. And then, of course, the next stage is indeed imperialism. And Iran is totally unprepared for that. And Iran is, I think it's very important to realize, and I repeat that for that reason, Iran is effectively, before the modern period, that is before the 20th century, a landlocked country. It's very hard to communicate between Iran and the outside world.
You have to go through Russia, which is arduous and long, and half the year it's blocked. You have to go to hostile Ottoman territory. As a Shi'i person, it's not easy. And there are lots of robbers, you know, Iraq and Eastern Anatolia. It's dangerous, it's infested with bandits. You have the vast deserts separating Iran from India, you know, through Kandahar or Baluchistan. If you've ever been there, it's a lunar landscape for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And then, yes, you have the Persian Gulf, but the Persian Gulf was barely Iranian territory until the Pahlavis in the way. It was not an integral part of Iran. And even the Persian Gulf was not easy because, you know, before the Suez Canal, you know, ships would sail around Africa. Before going into Iran, they had to go to India because of the monsoon winds. You could only go a certain time of the year because of the prevailing winds. You first went to Bombay, and then you went, or Surat, and then you went to the Persian Gulf. So Iran is in that sense a total backwater. And then it didn't have too much to offer. So in other words, it was also not really the target of Western ventures and Western initiatives. There's a reason why the British went to India in the end and grabbed it rather than Iran. So for all these reasons, Iran was also not well positioned in a way to remain the crossroads of the new currents, economic and political and technological currents. So I think that plays into it as well. I don't know if that's a bit of an answer to your question, but yes.
I have a methodological question.
Sure.
Your talk is focused on establishing that the idea of autarky remained as sort of a substratum of Iran.
Yes, yes.
You also mentioned several times that economics is never a discourse that's divorced from culture.
Right.
But if culture is always constructed according to a particular time and place, can you give us some examples of maybe a thicker historicist description where this idea of autarky is deployed in a very particular cultural discourse?
Right.
So maybe when the Safavids is in power, someone is deployed in Shi'i terms.
Right.
Or, you know, some other sort of example. Are you interested
Yeah.
in that sort of?
I would say I understand your question. It's a very good one, and I would say I wish. I can't in most cases because there is not enough thickness to work with. There's not enough embeddedness to work with. What I do instead, to make up for that in part, is to position it in sort of real economic and geographical circumstances at a given time. That yes, the Westerners were engaged in ferreting or spiriting bullion out of Iran, so the instinct of trying to keep it in the country was actually natural in 1675. So it's not simply a cultural argument, it is also embedded in real, you know, relationships of, you know, power and subordination, for example. But I wish I would have more of what you're saying, because that, I realize that that's a very important component that is not well represented in my paper. Absolutely, and it's well taken, that comment. And I will, when I definitively write it up, will definitely do so with an eye to that, because it is a very important part of it. Thank you for that.
Just one more question, if there's one out there.
It's not a question, it's an observation. I kind of think it's coincident. When you talk about self-sufficiency and balance, excuse me, and it's a product of the Iranian and American relationship, always sort of comparing those two. But in America, it was the transcendentalists, right? The transcendentalists of
Right.
Emerson.
Yes, of course.
And they were some poets.
Right.
It's really interesting how it's correct, in a sense. And I think back to the first question was about, which is, I think it's just all a head game in a sense, right?
It's all what?
It's a head game. It's a way of thinking, a way of presenting themselves.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
a little bit of a bluff.
And a lot of it is, yeah. A lot of it is, yes, absolutely. And I use the term presumptuousness a few times, and that's sort of equivalent to bluff, yes. Absolutely. There's a lot of sort of, you know, unthinking, instinctive, you know, grandstanding and posing and so forth involved. And all countries do that in some ways. You know, the last thing I want to do is sort of, you know, run down the Iranians and put them in a corner. Because you can do this for any, you can do this for the French really easily, you know, in many ways, for example.
You can do it for Americans. But I try to sort of lift it out from above, from over and above, stereotyping over time. That's precisely the danger that I know in years in this kind of paper, and I'd like to, by way of presenting this to a critical audience, getting some caveats from it, and ultimately, hopefully, being able to incorporate